Hey, little dude. Glad you could make it. Your mom says that you were, hey, Sparky. Says you were after me because you saw me in the Discord, but I wasn't streaming yet. Sorry about that. Had a couple technical difficulties. But everything should be good now. Just got to throw out a couple of promo posts. And we'll get into it. You ready for the end of the story, little dude? Oh, man, I'm a bit tired. I told you guys about that 10K ride that I did the other day. Apparently, it took more out of me than I thought because I went to go ride my bike again early this morning before breakfast, and yeah, my knees were like, nope, not doing it. So I did a really short ride and came back and played video games because, as you do. By the way, anybody have any good recommendations for like an AirPod kind of a thing that's not AirPods or headphones or something? Not a headset, because I've got my my Blue Yeti mic, but something else. I was brushing little black specks and particles from the ear cups of my current headphones. I think they're dead. They've been held together all this time with zip ties and duct tape, but the actual ear cups are half detached and disintegrating and leaving bits of material behind, so it's probably time to replace them. You flung arrows today. Did you forget your bows? You just brought the quiver and the arrows and you're like, Hah! Of course you guys couldn't see the gesture, but I totally made a throwing gesture. I'm still super happy you got that chicken charm. Made my day. It's epic. What's not cool? I'm cool. Sort of cool. Mostly cool. I tell myself I'm cool. It's been time to replace them for years. I haven't had them that long, really. I mean, honestly, I had to add the zip ties and the duct tape 30 days in. So. Well, that's cool. Don't laugh at me. That's not nice. It's not nice, Sparky. Picking on me. No. Leaving debris behind is not cool. But you know what is cool? Finishing another book with you guys. Also cool patterns. I like that one. Snickering isn't laughing? Uh-huh. You're right. It's meaner than just laughing. It's less nice. Also, did I break the follower goal? Huh. I think I set the follower goal wrong. It was supposed to be 7 follows in 7 days. I've just been on that for a while. And it says there's 15 days to go. Oops. We'll just hide that. Pretend it wasn't bad. Oh, did you break some or lose some? Or is there some tradition at the range where you Always leave an arrow behind for like new shooters or something. All right. Anyway, we should be finishing. We don't have a whole lot left. Maybe 45 pages left. We ought to be able to do that today. So we're on chapter 25 in Balquhidder. They had been taking refuge up at the top of that mountain in the place that I did a horrible job trying to pronounce, and kind of intimidated one of the residents in the nearby village to go get them some supplies or some money. And then that guy tried to keep the button that Alan Breck, that's right, Alan, used as a proof of identity. At the door of the first house we came to, Oops. At the door of the first house we came to, Alan knocked, which was no very safe enterprise in such a part of the Highlands as the Braes of Balquhidder. No great clan held rule there. It was filled and disputed by small septs and broken remnants, and what they call chiefless folk, driven into the wild country about the springs of Forth and Teeth by the advance of the Campbells. Here were Stuarts and MacLarens, which came to the same thing, for the MacLarens followed Alan's chief in war, and made but one clan with Appin. Here, too, were many of that old, prescribed, nameless, red-handed clan of the MacGregors. They had always been ill-considered, and now, worse than ever, having credit with no side or party in the whole country of Scotland. Their chief, MacGregor of MacGregor, was in exile. The more immediate leader of that part of them, about Balquhidder, James Moore, Rob Roy's eldest son, lay waiting his trial in Edinburgh Castle. They were in ill blood with Highlander and Lowlander, with the Grahams, the MacLarens, and the Stuarts. And Alan, who took up the quarrel of any friend, however distant, was extremely wishful to avoid them. Chance served us very well, for it was a household of MacLarens that we found, where Alan was not only welcome for his name's sake, but known by reputation. Here, then, I was got to bed without delay, and a doctor fetched, who found me in a sorry plight. But whether because he was a very good doctor, or I a very strong young man, I lay bedridden for no more than a week, and before a month I was able to take the road again with a good heart. All this time Alan would not leave me, though I often pressed him, and indeed his foolhardiness in staying was a common subject of outcry with the 2 or 3 friends that were let into the secret. He hid by day in a hole of the braes under a little wood, and at night, when the coast was clear, would come into the house to visit me. I need not say if I was pleased to see him. Mrs. MacLaren, our hostess, thought nothing good enough for such a guest, and as Duncan Dhu, which is the name of our host, had a pair of pipes in his house, and was much of a lover of music, the time of my recovery was quite a festival, and we commonly turned night into day. The soldiers let us be, although once a party of 2 companies and some dragoons went by in the bottom of the valley, where I could see them through the window as I lay in bed. What was much more astonishing, no magistrate came near me, and there was no question put of whence I came or whither I was going, and in that time of excitement I was as free of all inquiry as though I had lain in a desert. Yet my presence was known before I left to all the people in Balquhidder and the adjacent parts, many coming about the house on visits, and these, after the custom of the country, spreading the news among their neighbors. The bills, too, had now been printed. There was one pinned near the foot of my bed, where I could read my own, not very flattering portrait, and, in larger characters, the amount of the blood money that had been set upon my life. Duncan Dhu and the rest knew that I had come there in Alan's company, could have entertained no doubt of who I was, and many others must have had their guess. For though I had changed my clothes, I could not change my age or person, and lowland boys of 18 were not so rife in these parts of the world, and above all about that time, that they could fail to put one thing with another, and connect me with the bill. So it was, at least. Other folk keep a secret among 2 or 3 friends, and somehow it leaks out. But among these clansmen it is told to a whole countryside, and they will keep it for a century. There was but one thing happened worth narrating, and that is the visit I had of Robin Oig, one of the sons of the notorious Rob Roy. He was sought upon all sides on a charge of carrying a young woman from Balfron and marrying her, as was alleged, by force. Yet he stepped about Balquhidder like a gentleman in his own walled policy. It was he who had shot James McLaren at the plough stilts, a quarrel never satisfied. Yet he walked into the house of his blood enemies as a rider might into a public inn. Duncan had time to pass me word of who it was, and we looked at one another in concern. You should understand, it was then close upon the time of Alan's coming. The two were little likely to agree, and yet if we sent word or sought to make a signal, it was sure to arouse suspicion in a man under so dark a cloud as the MacGregor. He came in with a great show of civility, but, like a man among inferiors, took off his bonnet to Mrs. McLaren, but clapped it on his head again to speak to Duncan, and having thus set himself, as he would have thought, in a proper light, came to my bedside and bowed. I am given to know, sir, says he, that your name is Balfour. They call me David Balfour, said I, at your service. I would give you my name in return, sir, he replied, but it's one somewhat blown upon of late days, and it'll perhaps suffice if I tell you that I am own brother to James More Drummond or MacGregor, of whom you will scarce have failed to hear. No, sir, said I, a little alarmed, nor yet of your father, MacGregor Campbell, and I sat up and bowed in bed, for I thought best to compliment him, in case he was proud of having had an outlaw to his father. He bowed in return. But what I am come to say, sir, he went on, is this. In the year 45, my brother raised a part of the Gregara, and marched 6 companies to strike a stroke for the good side. And the surgeon that marched with our clan and cured my brother's leg when it was broken in the brush at Preston Pans was a gentleman of the same name precisely as yourself. He was brother to Balfour of Bath, and if you are in any reasonable degree of nearness one of that gentleman's kin, I have come to put myself and my people at your command. You are to remember that I knew no more of my descent than any cadger's dog. My uncle, to be sure, had prated of some of our high connections, but nothing to the present purpose, and there was nothing left me but that bitter disgrace of owning that I could not tell. Robin told me shortly that he was sorry he had put himself about, turned his back upon me without a sign of salutation, and as he went toward the door, I could hear him telling Duncan that I was only some kinless loon that didn't know his own father. Angry as I was at these words, and ashamed of my own ignorance, I could scarce keep from smiling that a man who was under the lash of the law, and was indeed hanged some 3 years later, should be so nice as to the dissent of his acquaintances. Just in the door he met Alan coming in, and the two drew back and looked at each other like strange dogs. They were neither of them big men, but they seemed fairly to swell out with pride. Each wore a sword, and by a movement of his haunch thrust clear the hilt of it, so that it might be the more readily grasped, and the blade drawn. Mr. Stewart, I am thinking, says Robin. Troth, Mr. MacGregor, it's not a name to be ashamed of, answered Alan. I did not know you were in my country, sir, said Robin. It sticks in my mind that I am in the country of my friends the MacLarens, says Alan. That's a kittle point, returned the other. There may be 2 words to say to that, but I think I will have heard that you are a man of your sword. Unless you were born deaf, Mr. MacGregor, you will have heard a good deal more than that, says Alan. I am not the only man that can draw steel in Appin, and when my kinsman and captain, Ardshiel, had a talk with a gentleman of your name, not so many years back, I could never hear that the MacGregor had the best of it. Do you mean my father, sir? Says Robin. Well, I wouldn't wonder, says Alan. The gentleman I have in mind had the ill taste to clap Campbell to his name. My father was an old man, returned Robin. The match was unequal. You and me would make a better pair, sir. I was thinking that, said Alan. I was half out of bed, and Duncan had been hanging at the elbow of these fighting cocks, ready to intervene upon the least occasion. But when that word was uttered, it was a case of now or never, and Duncan, with something of a white face to be sure, thrust himself between. Gentlemen, said he, I will have been thinking of a very different matter, whatever. Here are my pipes, and here are you 2 gentlemen who are baith accomplished pipers. It's an odd dispute which one will use the best. Here will be a braw chance to settle it. Why, sir, said Allan, still addressing Robin, from whom he indeed not so much as shifted his eyes, nor yet Robin from him. Why, sir, says Allan, I think I will have heard some so of the sort. Have you music, as folks say? Are you a bit of a piper? I can pipe like a macramon, cries Robin. And that is a very bold word, quoth Allan. I have made bolder words good before now, returned Robin, and that against better adversaries. It's easy to try that, says Allan. Duncan Dhu made haste to bring out the pair of pipes that was his principal possession, and to set before his guests a mutton ham and a bottle of that drink which they call Athol Brose, which is made of old whiskey, strained honey, and sweet cream, slowly beaten together in the right order and proportion. The two enemies were still on the very breach of a quarrel, but down they sat, one upon each side of the peat fire, with a mighty show of politeness. MacLaren pressed them to taste his mutton ham, and the wife's brose, reminding them the wife was out of Athol, and had a name far and wide for her skill in that confection. But Robin put aside these hospitalities as bad for the breath. I would have you to remark, sir, says Allan, that I havena broken bread for near upon 10 hours, which will be worse for the breath than any brose in Scotland. I will take no advantages, Mr. Stewart, replied Robin. Eat and drink. I'll follow you. Each ate a small portion of the ham, and drank a glass of the brose to Mrs. MacLaren, and then, after a great number of civilities, Robin took the pipes and played a little spring in a very ranting manner. Aye, you can blow, said Allan, and taking the instrument from his rival, he first played the same spring in a manner identical with Robin's, and then wandered into variations, which as he went on he decorated with a perfect flight of grace notes, such as pipers love and call the warblers. I had been very pleased with Robin's playing. Allan's ravished me. That's no very bad, Mr. Stewart, said the rival, but to show a poor device in your warblers. Me, cried Allan, the blood starting to his face. I give you the lie. Do you own yourself beaten at the pipes, then, said Robin, that you seek to change them for the sword? And that's very well said, Mr. McGregor, returned Allan. And in the meantime, laying a strong accent on the word, I take back the lie. I appeal to Duncan. Indeed, ye need appeal to naebody, said Robin. You're a far better judge than a MacLaren and Balquhidder, for it's a God's truth that you're a very creditable piper for a Stewart. Hand me the pipes. Allan did it as he asked, and Robin proceeded to imitate and correct some part of Allan's variations, which it seemed that he remembered perfectly. Aye, you have music, said Allan gloomily. And now you be the judge yourself, Mr. Stewart, said Robin, taking up the variations from the beginning. He worked them throughout to so new a purpose, with such ingenuity and sentiment, and with so odd a fancy, and so quick a knack in the grace notes, that I was amazed to hear him. As for Allan, his face grew dark and hot, and he sat and gnawed his fingers, like a man under some deep affront. Enough, he cried. You can blow the pipes. Make the most of that. And he made as if to rise. But Robin only held out his hand as if to ask for silence, and struck into the slow measure of a pibroch. It was a fine piece of music in itself, and nobly played, but it seems, besides, it was a piece peculiar to the Appin Stewarts, and a chief favourite with Allan. The first notes were scarce out, before there came a change in his face. When the time quickened, he seemed to grow restless in his seat, and long before that piece was at an end, the last signs of his anger died from him, and he had no thought but for the music. Robin Oig, he said, when it was done, you're a great piper. I am not fit to blow in the same kingdom with you. Body of me, you have more music in your sporran than I have in my hand, and though it still sticks in my mind that I could maybe show you another of it with the cold steel, I warn you beforehand, it'll no be fair. It would go against my heart to haggle a man that can blow the pipes as you can. Thereupon the quarrel was made up. All night long the brose was going, and the pipes changing hands, and the day had come pretty bright, and the 3 men were none the better for what they had been taking, before Robin as much as thought upon the road. It was the last I saw of him, for I was in the Low Countries at the University of Leyden when he stood his trial, and was hanged in the grass market. And I have told this at so great length, partly because it was the last instant of any note that befell me on the wrong side of the Highland line, and partly because, as the man came to be hanged, it's in a manner history. Chapter 26. End of the flight. We pass the Forth. The month, as I've said, was not yet out, but it was already far through August, and beautiful warm weather, with every sign of an early and great harvest, when I was pronounced able for my journey. Our money was now run to so low an ebb that we must think first of all on speed, for we came not soon to Mr. Rainkeller's, or if when we came there he should fail to help me, we must surely starve. In Allan's view, besides, the hunt must have now greatly slackened, and the line of the Forth and even Stirling Bridge, which is the main pass over that river, would be watched with little interest. It's a chief principle in military affairs, said he, to go where you are least expected. Forth is our trouble. You ken the saying, Forth bridles the wild Highlandman. Well, if we seek to creep round about the head of that river, and come down by Kippen or Balfron, it's just precisely there that they'll be looking to lay hands on us. But if we stay straight to the old bridge of Stirling, I'll lay my sword they let us pass unchallenged. The first night, accordingly, we pushed to the house of a MacLaren in Strathar, a friend of Duncan's, where we slept the 21st of the month, and whence we set forth again about the fall of night to make another easy stage. The 22nd we lay in a heather bush on the hillside of Oamvar, within view of a herd of deer, the happiest 10 hours of sleep, in a fine, breathing sunshine, and on bone-dry ground that I have ever tasted. That night we struck Allan Water, and followed it down, and coming to the edge of the hills, saw the whole carse of Stirling underfoot, as flat as a pancake, with the town and castle on a hill in the middle of it, and the moon shining on the links of Forth. Now, says Allan, I kenna if you care, but you're in your own land again. We passed the Hieland line in the first hour, and now, if we could but pass yon crooked water, we might cast our bonnets in the air. In Allan Water, near by where it falls into the Forth, we found a little sandy islet, overgrown with burdock, butterbur, and the like low plants, that would just cover us if we lay flat. Here it was we made our camp, within plain view of Stirling Castle, whence we could hear the drums beat as some part of the garrison paraded. Shearers worked all day in a field on one side of the river, and we could hear the stones going on the hooks, and the voices, and even the words of the men talking. It behooved to lie close and keep silent, but the sand of the little isle was sun-warm, the green plants gave us shelter for our heads. We had food and drink in plenty, and to crown all, we were within sight of safety. As soon as the shearers quit their work, and the dusk began to fall, we waded ashore and struck for the bridge of Stirling, keeping to the fields and under the field fences. The bridge is close under the castle hill, an old, high, narrow bridge, with pinnacles along the parapet, and you may conceive with how much interest I looked upon it, not only as a place famous in history, but as the very doors of salvation to Allan and myself. The moon was not yet up when we came there. A few lights shone along the front of the fortress, and lower down a few lighted windows in the town. But it was all mighty still, and there seemed to be no guards upon the passage. I was for pushing straight across, but Allan was more wary. It looks unco quiet, said he, but for all that we'll lie down here cannily behind a dyke, and make sure. So we lay for about a quarter of an hour, whiles whispering, whiles lying still, and hearing nothing earthly but the washing of the water on the piers. At last there came by an old hobbling woman with a crutch stick, who first stopped a little, close to where we lay, and bemoaned herself and the long way she had travelled, and then set forth again up the steep spring of the bridge. The woman was so little, and the night still so dark, that we soon lost sight of her, only heard the sound of her steps, and her stick, and a cough that she had by fits draw slowly farther away. She's bound to be across now, I whispered. Nah, said Allan, her foot still sounds boss upon the bridge. And just then, who goes? Cried a voice, and we heard the butt of a musket rattle on the stones. I must suppose the sentry had been sleeping, so that had we tried, we might have passed unseen, but he was awake now, and the chance forfeited. This'll never do, said Allan. This'll never do for us, David. And without another word, he began to crawl away through the fields, and a little after, being well out of eyeshot, got to his feet again, and struck along a road that led to the eastward. I could not conceive what he was doing, and indeed I was so sharply cut by the disappointment that I was little likely to be pleased with anything. A moment back, and I had seen myself knocking at Mr. Rainkeller's door to claim my inheritance, like a hero in a ballad, And here I was, back again, a wandering, hunted blackguard, on the wrong side of Forth. Well, said I. Well, said Allen, what would you have? They're none such fools as I took them for. We have still the Forth to pass. Davy, weary fall the rains that fed and the hillsides that guided it. And why go east, said I. Oh, just upon the chance, said he. If we cannot pass the river, we'll have to see what we can do for the Firth. There are fords upon the river, and none upon the Firth, said I. To be sure there are fords, and a bridge forby, quoth Allen, and of what service when they are watched? Well, said I, but a river can be swum. By them that have the skill of it, returned he. But I have yet to hear that either you or me is much of a hand at that exercise, and for my own part, I swim like a stone. I'm not up to talk to you in talking back, Allen, I said, but I can see we're making bad worse. If it's hard to pass a river, it stands to reason it must be worse to pass a sea. But there's such a thing as a boat, says Allen, or I'm the more deceived. Aye, and such a thing as money, says I. But for us that have neither one nor other, they might just as well not have been invented. You think so, said Allen. I do that, said I. David, says he, you're a man of small invention and less faith. But let me set my wits upon the hone, and if I cannot beg, borrow, nor yet steal a boat, I'll make one. I think I see, said I, and what's more than all that, if you pass a bridge, it can tell no tales. But if we pass the Firth, there's the boat on the wrong side. Somebody must have brought it. The countryside will all be in a biz. Man, cried Allen, if I make a boat, I make a body to take it back again. So deal me with no more of your nonsense, but walk, for that's what you've got to do, and let Allen think for ye. All night then we walked through the north side of the Carse, under the high line of the Oakhill Mountains, and by Alos and Clackaman and Curos, all of which we avoided, and about 10 in the morning, mighty hungry and tired, came to the little clachan of lime kilns. This is a place that sits near in by the waterside, and looks across the Hope to the town of Queensferry. Smoke went up from both of these, and from other villages and farms upon all hands. The fields were being reaped. 2 ships lay anchored, and boats were coming and going on the Hope. It was altogether a right pleasant sight to me, and I could not take my fill of gazing at these comfortable, green, cultivated hills, and the busy people both of the field and sea. For all that, there was Mr. Rainkeller's house on the south shore, where I had no doubt wealth awaited me, and here I was upon the north, clad in poor enough attire of an outlandish fashion, with 3 silver shillings left to me of all my fortune, a price set upon my head, and an outlawed man for my sole company. Oh, Allen, said I, to think of it! Over there's all that heart could want waiting me, and the birds go over, and the boats go over, all that please can go, but just me only. Oh, man, but it's a heartbreak. In Limekilns we entered a small change house, which we only knew to be a public by the wand over the door, and bought some bread and cheese from a good-looking lass that was the servant. This we carried with us in a bundle, meaning to sit and eat it in a bush of wood on the seashore, that we saw some 1/3 part of a mile in front. As we went, I kept looking across the water and sighing to myself, and though I took no heed of it, Allen had fallen into a muse. At last he stopped in the way. "Did you take heed of the lass we bought this of?" says he, tapping on the bread and cheese. "To be sure," said I, "and a bonny lass she was." "You thought that?" cries he. "Man, David, that's good news." "In the name of all that's wonderful, why so?" says I. "What good can that do?" "Well," says Allen, with one of the droll looks, "I was rather in hopes it may get us that boat." "If it were the other way around, it would be liker it," said I. "That's all that you ken, you see," said Allen. "I don't want the lass to fall in love with you. I want her to be sorry for you, David, to which end there is no manner of need that she should take you for a beauty. Let me see," looking me curiously over. "I wish you were a wee thing paler, but apart from that you'll do fine for my purpose. You have a fine hang-dog, rag-and-tatter, clapper-maclaw kind of look to you, as if you had stolen the coat from a potato bogle. Come, right about, and back to the change-house for that boat of ours." I followed him, laughing. "David Balfour," said he, You're a very funny gentleman and by your own way of it, and this is a very funny employ for you, no doubt. For all that, if you have any affection for my neck, to say nothing of your own, you will perhaps be kind enough to take this matter responsibly. I am going to do a bit of play acting, the bottom ground of which is just exactly as serious as the gallows for the pair of us. So bear it, if you please, in mind, and conduct yourself according. Well, well, said I, have it as you will. As we got near the clachan, he made me take his arm and hang upon it like one almost helpless with weariness, and by the time he pushed open the change-house door, he seemed to be half carrying me. The maid appeared surprised, as well she might be, at our speedy return, but Alan had no words to spare for her in explanation, helped me to a chair, and called for a tass of brandy, with which he fed me in little sips, and then, breaking up the bread and cheese, helped me to eat it like a nursery lass, the whole with that grave, concerned, affectionate countenance that might have imposed upon a judge. It was a small wonder if the maid were taken with the picture we presented, of a poor, sick, overwrought lad, and his most tender comrade. She drew quite near, and stood leaning with her back on the next table. "What's like wrong with him?" she said at last. Alan turned upon her, to my great wonder, with a kind of fury. "Wrong?" cries he. "He's walked more hundreds of miles than he has hairs upon his chin, and slept oftener in wet heather than dry sheets. Wrong, quoth she. Wrong enough, I would think. Wrong indeed." And he kept grumbling to himself as he fed me, like a man ill-pleased. "He's young for the like of that," said the maid. "O'er young," said Alan, with his back to her. "He'd be better riding," says he. "And where could I get a horse to him?" cried Alan, turning on her with the same appearance of fury. "Would you have me steal?" I thought this roughness would have sent her off in dudgeon, as indeed it closed her mouth for the time. But my companion knew very well what he was doing, and for as simple as he was in some things of life, had a great fund of roguishness in such affairs as these. "You needn't tell me," she said at last. "You're gentry." "Well," said Alan, softened a little, I believe against his will, by this artless comment. "And suppose we were, did you ever hear that gentress put money in folks' pockets?" She sighed at this, as if she were herself some disinherited great lady. "No," says she, "that's true indeed." I was all this while chafing at the part I played, and sitting tongue-tied between shame and merriment. But somehow, at this, I could hold in no longer, and bade Alan let me be, for I was better already. My voice stuck in my throat, for I ever hated to take the part in lies, but my very embarrassment helped on the plot, for the last no doubt set down by my husky voice to sickness and fatigue. "Has he no friends?" said she, in a tearful voice. "That has he so," cried Alan. "If we could but win to them. Friends, and rich friends, beds to lie in, foods to eat, doctors to see to him, and here he must tramp in the dubs, and sleep in the heather like a beggarman." "And why that?" says the lass. "My dear," said Alan, "I canna very safely say, but I'll tell you what I'll do instead," says he. "I'll whistle you a bit tune." And with that, he leaned pretty far over the table, and a mere breath of a whistle, but with a wonderful pretty sentiment, gave her a few bars of "Charlie is my darling." "Wheesht," says she, and looks over her shoulder to the door. "That's it," said Alan. "Him so young," cries the lass. "He's old enough to—" and Alan stuck his forefinger on the back part of his neck, meaning I was old enough to lose my head. "It would be a black shame," she cried, flushing high. "It's what will be, though," said Alan, "unless we manage the better." At this, the lass turned and ran out of that part of the house, leaving us alone together. Alan, in high good humour at the furthering of his schemes, and I in bitter dudgeon at being called a Jacobite and treated like a child. "Alan," I cried, "I can stand no more of this." "You'll have to sit it then, Davy," said he, "for if you upset the pot now, you may scrape your own life out of the fire, but Alan Breck is a dead man." This was so true that I could only groan, and even my groan served Alan's purpose, for it was overheard by the lass as she came flying in again with a dish of white puddings and a bottle of strong ale. "Poor lamb," says she, and had no sooner set the meat before us than she touched me on the shoulder with a little friendly touch, as much to bid me cheer up. Then she told us to fall to, and there would be no more to pay, for the inn was her own, or at least her father's, and he was gone for the day to Pittencrieff. We waited for no second bidding, for bread and cheese is but cold comfort, and the pudding smelt excellently well. And while we sat and ate, she took up that same place by the next table, looking on and thinking, and frowning to herself, and drawing the string of her apron through her hand. "I'm thinking you have rather a long tongue," she said at last to Alan. "Aye," said Alan, "but you see I ken the folk I speak to." "I would never betray ye," said she, "if you mean that." "No," said he, "you're not that kind. But I tell you what you would do. You would help." "I couldna," said she, shaking her head. "Na, I couldna." "No," said he, "but if you could." She answered him nothing. "Look here, my lass," said Alan. "There are boats in the kingdom of Fife, for I saw two, no less, upon the beach, as I came in by your town's end. Now, if we could have the use of a boat to pass under cloud of night into Lothian, and some secret, decent kind of man to bring that boat back again, and keep his counsel, there would be 2 souls saved, mine to all likelihood, his to a dead surety. If we lack that boat, we have but 3 shillings left in this wide world, and where to go and how to do, and what other place there is for us, except the chains of a gibbet. I give you my naked word, I kenna. Shall we go wanting, lassie? Are ye to lie in your warm bed and think upon us, when the wind growls in the chimney, and the rain tirls on the roof? Are ye to eat your meat by the cheeks of a red fire, and think upon this poor sick lad of mine, biting his finger ends on a blame mar for cold and hunger? Sick or sound, he must aye be moving, with the death grapple at his throat. He must aye be trailing in the rain on the lang roads, and when he gants his last on a rickle of cold stands, there will be nae friends near him, but only me and God." At this appeal, I could see the lass was in great trouble of mind, being tempted to help, and yet in some fear she might be helping malefactors. And so now I determined to step in myself and to allay her scruples with a portion of the truth. "Did you ever hear," said I, "of Mr. Rainkeller of the ferry?" "Rainkeller the writer," said she, "I dare say that." "Well," said I, "it's to his door that I am bound, so you may judge by that if I am an ill-doer. And I will tell you more, that though I am indeed, by a dreadful error and some peril of my life, King George has no truer friend in all Scotland than myself." Her face cleared up mightily at this, although Alan's darkened. "That's more than I would ask," said she. "Mr. Rainkeller is a kint man." And she bade us finish her meat, get clear of the clachan as soon as may be, and lie close in the bit wood on the sea beach. "And you can trust me," says she. "I'll find some means to put you over." At this we waited for no more, but shook hands with her upon the bargain, made short work of the puddings, and set forth again from lime kilns as far as to the wood. It was a small piece of perhaps a score of elders and hawthorns, and a few young ashes, not thick enough to veil us from passers-by upon the road or beach. Here we must lie, however, making the best of the brave warm weather, and the good hopes we now had of a deliverance, and planning more particularly what remained for us to do. We had but one trouble all day, when a strolling piper came and sat in the same wood with us, a red-nosed, blear-eyed, drunken dog, with a great bottle of whiskey in his pocket, and a long story of wrongs that had been done him by all sorts of persons, from the Lord President of the Court of Session, who had denied him justice, down to the bailies of Inverkeithing, who had given him more of it than he desired. It was impossible but he should conceive some suspicion of 2 men lying all day concealed in a thicket, and having no business to allege. As long as he stayed there, he kept us in hot water with prying questions, and after he was gone, as he was a man not very likely to hold his tongue, we were in the greater impatience to be gone ourselves. The day came to an end with the same brightness. The night fell quiet and clear. Lights came out in houses and hamlets, and then, one after another, began to be put out. But it was past 11, and we were long since strangely tortured with anxieties, before we heard the grinding of oars upon the rowing pins. At that we looked out and saw the lass herself coming rowing to us in a boat. She had trusted no one with our affairs, not even her sweetheart, if she had one, but as soon as her father was asleep, had left the house by a window, stolen a neighbor's boat, and come to our assistance single-handed. I was abashed how to find expression for my thanks, but she was no less abashed at the thought of hearing them, begged us to lose no time and to hold our peace, saying, very properly, that the heart of our matter was in haste and silence. And so, what with one thing and another, she had set us on the Lothian shore, not far from Carridon, had shaken hands with us, and was out again at sea and rowing for lime kilns, before there was one word said either of her service or our gratitude. Even after she was gone, we had nothing to say, as indeed nothing was enough for such a kindness. Only Alan stood a great while upon the shore, shaking his head. "It's a very fine lass," he said at last. "David, it's a very fine lass." And a matter of an hour later, as we were lying in a din on the seashore, and I had been already dozing, he broke out again in commendations of her character. For my part, I could say nothing. She was so simple a creature that my heart smote me both with remorse and fear. Remorse, because we had traded upon her ignorance, and fear, lest we should have any way involved her in the dangers of our situation. Chapter 27. I come to Mr. Rankeller. The next day it was agreed that Alan should fend for himself till sunset, but as soon as it began to grow dark, he should lie in the fields by the roadside near Newhalls, and stir for naught until he heard me whistling. At first I proposed I should give him for a signal the bonny house of Arley, which was a favourite of mine, but he objected that as the piece was very commonly known, any ploughman might whistle it by accident, and taught me instead a little fragment of a Highland air, which has run in my head from that day to this, and will likely run in my head when I lay dying. Every time it comes to me, it takes me off to that last day of my uncertainty, with Alan sitting up in the bottom of the den, whistling and beating the measure with a finger, and the grey of the dawn coming on his face. I was in the long street of Queensferry before the sun was up. It was a fairly built burg, the houses of good stone, many slated, the town hall not so fine, I thought, as that of Peebles, nor yet the street so noble, but take it all together, it put me to shame for my foul tatters. As the morning went on, and the fires began to be kindled, and the windows to open, and the people to appear out of the houses, my concern and despondency grew ever the blacker. I saw now that I had no grounds to stand upon, and no clear proof of my rights, nor so much as my own identity. If it was all a bubble, I was indeed sorely cheated and left in a sore pass. Even if things were as I conceived, it would, in all likelihood, take time to establish my contentions, and what time I had to spare, with less than 3 shillings in my pocket, and a condemned, hunted man upon my hands to ship out of the country. Truly, if my hope broke with me, it might come to the gallows yet for both of us. And as I continued to walk up and down, and saw people looking askance at me upon the street, or out of windows, and nudging or speaking one to another with smiles, I began to take a fresh apprehension, that it might be no easy matter even to come to the speech of the lawyer, far less to convince him of my story. For the life of me, I could not muster up the courage to address any of these reputable burghers. I thought shame even to speak with them in such a pickle of rags and dirt, and if I had asked for the house of such a man as Mr. Rankeller, I suppose they would have burst out laughing in my face. So I went up and down, and through the street, and down to the harbour side, like a dog that has lost its master, with a strange gnawing in my inwards, and, every now and then, a movement of despair. It grew to be high day at last, perhaps 9 in the forenoon, and I was worn with all these wanderings, and chanced to have stopped in front of a very good house on the landward side, a house with beautiful clear glass windows, flowering knots upon the sills, the walls new harled, and a chase dog sitting yawning on the step, like one that was at home. Well, I was even envying this dumb brute, when the door fell open, and there issued forth a shrewd, ruddy, kindly, consequential man in a well-powdered wig and spectacles. I was in such a plight that no one set eyes on me once, but he looked at me again, and this gentleman, as it proved, was so much struck with my poor appearance that he came straight up to me and asked me what I did. I told him I was come to Queensferry on business, and taking heart of grace, asked him to direct me to the house of Mr. Rankeller. "Why," said he, "that is his house that I have just come out of, and for a rather singular chance, I am that very man." Then, sir, said I have to beg the favor of an interview. I do not know your name, said he, nor yet your face. My name is David Balfour, said I. David Balfour, he repeated, in rather a high tone, like one surprised. And where have you come from, Mr. David Balfour? He asked, looking me pretty dryly in the face. I have come from a great many strange places, sir, said I, but I think it would be as well to tell you where and how, in a more private manner. He seemed to muse a while, holding his lip in his hand, and looking now at me, and now upon the causeway of the street. Yes, says he, that will be the best, no doubt. And he led me back with him into his house, cried out to someone whom I could not see that he would be engaged all morning, and brought me into a little dusty chamber full of books and documents. Here he sat down and bade me be seated, though I thought he looked a little ruefully from his clean chair to my muddy rags. And now, says he, if you have any business, pray be brief and come swiftly to the point. Nec germino bellum trohanum auditor ab ovo. Do you understand that? Says he, with a keen look. I will even do as Horace says, sir, I answered, smiling, and carry you in medias res. He nodded as if he was well pleased, and indeed his scrap of Latin that had been set to test me. For all that, and though I was somewhat encouraged, the blood came in my face when I added, I have reason to believe myself some rights on the estate of Shaw's. He got a paper book out of a drawer and set it before him open. Well, said he, but I had shot my bolt and sat speechless. Come, Mr. Balfour, said he, you must continue. Where were you born? In Essendine, sir, said I, in the year 1734, the 12th of March. He seemed to follow this statement in his paper book, but that meant I knew not. Your father and mother, said he. My father was Alexander Balfour, schoolmaster of that place, said I, and my mother, Grace Pitaro. I think her people were from Angus. Have you any papers proving your identity? Asked Mr. Rainkeller. No, sir, said I, but they are in the hands of Mr. Campbell, the minister, and could be readily produced. Mr. Campbell, too, would give me his word, and for that matter, I do not think my uncle would deny me. Meaning Mr. Ebenezer Balfour, says he. The same, said I. Whom have you seen? He asked. By whom I was received into his own house, I answered. Did you ever meet a man of the name of Hosian? Asked Mr. Rainkeller. I did so, sir, for my sins, said I, for it was by his means and the procurement of my uncle that I was kidnapped within sight of this town, carried to sea, suffered shipwreck and 100 other hardships, and stand before you today in this poor accoutrement. You say you were shipwrecked, said Rainkeller. Where was that? Off the south end of the Isle of Mull, said I. The name of the isle on which I was cast up is the Island Arid. Ah, says he, smiling, you are deeper than me in the geography. But so far, I may tell you, this agrees pretty exactly with other informations that I hold. But you say you were kidnapped? In what sense? In the plain meaning of the word, sir, said I. I was on my way to your house, when I was trepanned on board the brig, cruelly struck down, thrown below, and knew no more of anything till we were far at sea. I was destined for the plantations, a fate that, in God's providence, I have escaped. The brig was lost on June the 27th, says he, looking in his book, and we are now at August the 24th. Here is a considerable hiatus, Mr. Balfour, of near upon 2 months. It has already caused a vast amount of trouble to your friends, and I own I shall not be very well contented until it is set right. Indeed, sir, said I, these months are very easily filled up, but yet, before I told my story, I would be glad to know that I was talking to a friend. That is to argue in a circle, said the lawyer. I cannot be convinced till I have heard you. I cannot be your friend till I am properly informed. If you were more trustful, it would be better befit your time of life. And you know, Mr. Balfour, we have a proverb in the country that evildoers are evil dreaders. You are not to forget, sir, said I, that I have already suffered by my trustfulness, and was shipped off to be a slave by the very man that, if I rightly understand, is your employer. All this while I had been gaining ground with Mr. Rainkeller, and in proportion as I gained ground, gaining confidence. But at this sally, which I made with something of a smile myself, he fairly laughed aloud. No, no, said he, it is not so bad as that. Fui non sum. I was, indeed, your uncle's man of business, but while you, Imburbis juvenis custode remoto. We're gallivanting in the west. A good deal of water has run under the bridges, and if your ears did not sing, it was not for lack of being talked about. On the very day of your sea disaster, Mr. Campbell stalked into my office, demanding you from all the winds. I had never heard of your existence, but I had known your father, and from matters in my competence, to be touched upon hereafter, I was disposed to fear the worst. Mr. Ebenezer admitted having seen you, declared, what seemed improbable, that he had given you considerable sums, and that you had started for the continent of Europe, intending to fulfill your education, which was probable and praiseworthy. Interrogated how you had come to send no word to Mr. Campbell, he deponed that you had expressed a great desire to break with your past life. Further interrogated where you were now, protested ignorance, but believed you were in Leyden. That is a close sum of his replies. I am not exactly sure that anyone believed him, continued Mr. Rainkeller with a smile, and in particular he so much disrelished some expressions of mine that, in a word, he showed me to the door. We were then at a full stand. For whatever shrewd suspicions we might entertain, we had no shadow of probation. In the very article comes Captain Hosian with the story of your drowning, whereupon all fell through, with no consequences but concern to Mr. Campbell, injury to my pocket, and another blot upon your uncle's character, which could very ill afford it. And now, Mr. Balfour, said he, you understand the whole process of these matters, and can judge for yourself to what extent I may be trusted. Indeed, he was more pedantic than I can represent him, and placed more scraps of Latin in his speech, but it was all uttered with a fine geniality of eye and manner, which went far to conquer my distrust. Moreover, I could see how he now treated me as if I was myself beyond a doubt, so that first point of my identity seemed fully granted. Sir, said I, if I tell you my story, I must commit a friend's life to your discretion. Pass me your word it shall be sacred, and for what touches myself I will ask no better guarantee than just your face. He passed me his word very seriously. But, said he, these are rather alarming prolocutions, and if there are in your story any little jostles to the law, I would beg you to bear in mind that I am a lawyer, and pass lightly. Thereupon I told him my story from the first. He listening, with his spectacles thrust up and his eyes closed, so that I sometimes feared he was asleep. But in no such matter. He heard every word, as I found afterward, with such quickness of hearing and precision of memory as often surprised me. Even strange, outlandish Gaelic names, heard for that time only, he remembered and would remind me of years after. Yet, when I called Alan Breck in full, we had an odd scene. The name of Alan had of course rung through Scotland, with the news of the Appin murder and the offer of the reward, and it had no sooner escaped me than the lawyer moved in his seat and opened his eyes. I would name no unnecessary names, Mr. Balfour, said he, above all of Highlanders, many of whom are obnoxious to the law. Well, it might have been better not, said I, but since I have let it slip, I may as well continue. Not at all, said Mr. Rainkeller. I am somewhat dull of hearing, as you may have remarked, and I am far from sure I caught the name exactly. We will call your friend, if you please, Mr. Thompson, that there may be no reflections, and in future I would take some such way with any Highlander that you may have to mention, dead or alive. By this I saw he must have heard the name all too clearly, and had already guessed I might be coming to the murder. If he chose to play this part of ignorance, it was no matter of mine, so I smiled, saying it was no very Highland-sounding name, and consented. Through all the rest of my story, Alan was Mr. Thompson, which amused me the more, as it was a piece of policy after his own heart. James Stewart, in like manner, was mentioned under the style of Mr. Thompson's kinsman. Colin Campbell passed as a Mr. Glenn, and to Clooney, when I came to that part of my tale, I gave the name of Mr. Jameson, a Highland chief. It was truly the most open farce, and I wondered that the lawyer should care to keep it up. But, after all, it was quite in the taste of that age, when there were two parties in the state, and quiet persons, with no very high opinions of their own, sought out every cranny to avoid offence to either. Very well, said the lawyer, when I had quite done. This is a great epic, a great odyssey of yours. You must tell it, sir, in a sound Latinity, when your scholarship is riper. or in English if you please, though for my part I prefer the stronger tongue. You have rolled much, quid regio in terris. What parish in Scotland, to make a homely translation, has not been filled with your wanderings? You have shown, besides, a singular aptitude for getting into false positions, and yes, upon the whole, for behaving well in them. This Mr. Thompson seems to me a gentleman of some choice qualities, though perhaps a trifle bloody-minded. It would please me none the worse if, with all his merits, he were soused in the North Sea, for the man, Mr. David, is a sore embarrassment. But you are doubtless quite right to adhere to him. Indubitably he adhered to you. It comes, we may say, he was your true companion, nor less paribus curius vegetis fidget, for I dare say you had both taken order, thought upon the gallows. Well, these days are fortunately by, and I think, speaking humanly, that you are near the end of your troubles. As he thus moralized on my adventures, he looked upon me with so much humor and benignity that I could scarce contain my satisfaction. I had been so long wandering with lawless people, and making my bed upon the hills and under the bare sky, that to sit once more in a clean covered house, and to talk amicably with a gentleman in broadcloth, seemed mighty elevations. Even as I thought so, my eye fell on my unseemly tatters, and I was once more plunged in confusion. But the lawyer saw and understood me. He rose, called over the stair to lay another plate, for Mr. Balfour would stay to dinner, and led me into a bedroom in the upper part of the house. Here he set before me water and soap and a comb, and laid out some clothes that belonged to his son, and here, with another opposite tag, he left me to my toilet. Chapter 28. I go in quest of my inheritance. I made what change I could in my appearance, and blithe was I to look in the glass and find the beggarman a thing of the past, and David Balfour come to life again. And yet I was ashamed of the change too, and above all of the borrowed clothes. When I had done, Mr. Rainkiller caught me on the stair, made me his compliments, and had me again into the cabinet. "Sit ye down, Mr. David," said he, "and now that you are looking a little more like yourself, let me see if I can find you any news. You will be wondering, no doubt, about your father and your uncle. To be sure, it is a singular tale, and the explanation is one that I blush to have to offer you. For," says he, really with embarrassment, "the matter hinges on a love affair." "Truly," said I cannot very well join that notion with my uncle." "But your uncle, Mr. David, was not always old," replied the lawyer, "and what may perhaps surprise you more, not always ugly. He had a fine, gallant air. People stood in their open doors to look after him as he went by upon a metal horse. I've seen it with these eyes, and I ingenuously confess, not altogether without envy, for I was a plain lad myself, and a plain man's son, and in those days it was a case of audite que bella se sabel." "It sounds like a dream," said I. Aye, said the lawyer, "that is how it is with youth and age. Nor was that all, but he had a spirit of his own that seemed to promise great things in the future. In 1715, what must he do but run away to join the rebels? It was your father that pursued him, found him in a ditch, and brought him back, multum gentium, to the mirth of the whole country. However, majora cenimus, the two lads fell in love, and that with the same lady. Mr. Ebenezer, who was the admired and the beloved, and the spoiled one, made no doubt mighty certain of his victory, and when he found he had deceived himself, screamed like a peacock. The whole country heard of it. Now he lay sick at home, with his silly family standing round the bed in tears. Now he rode from public house to public house, and shouted his sorrows into the lug of Tom, Dick, and Harry. Your father, Mr. David, was a kind gentleman, but he was weak, dolefully weak. He took all this folly with a long countenance, and one day, by your leave, resigned the lady. She was no such fool, however. It's from her you must have inherited your excellent good taste, and she refused to be bandied from one to another. Both got upon their knees to her, and the upshot of the matter for that while was that she showed both of them the door. That was in August. Dear me, the same year I came from college. The scene must have been highly farcical. I thought myself it was a silly business, but I could not forget my father had a hand in it. Surely, sir, it had some note of tragedy, said I. Why, no, sir, not at all, returned the lawyer, for tragedy implies some ponderable matter in dispute, some dignus vindis notis, and this piece of work was all about the petulance of a young ass that had been spoiled, and wanted nothing so much as to be tied up and soundly belted. However, that was not your father's view, and the end of it was that from concession to concession on your father's part, and from one height to another of squalling, sentimental selfishness upon your uncle's, they came at last to drive a sort of bargain, from whose ill results you have recently been smarting. The one man took the lady, the other the estate. Now, Mr. David, they talk a great deal of charity and generosity, but in this disputable state of life, I often think the happiest consequences seem to flow when a gentleman consults his lawyer and takes all the law allows him. Anyhow, this piece of quixotry on your father's part, as it was unjust in itself, has brought forth a monstrous family of injustices. Your father and mother lived and died poor folk. You were poorly reared, and in the meanwhile, what a time it has been for the tenants on the estate of Shaw's. And, I might add, if it was a matter I cared much about, what a time for Mr. Ebenezer. And yet, that is certainly the strangest part of all, said I, that a man's nature should thus change. True, said Mr. Rankeller, and yet I imagine it was natural enough. He could not think that he had played a handsome part. Those who knew the story gave him the cold shoulder. Those who knew it not, seeing one brother disappear, and the other succeed in the estate, raised a cry of murder, so that upon all sides he found himself evited. Money was all he got by his bargain. Well, he came to think the more of money. He was selfish when he was young. He is selfish now that he is old, and the latter end of all these pretty manners and fine feelings you have seen for yourself. Well, sir, said I, and in all this, what is my position? The estate is yours beyond a doubt, replied the lawyer. It matters nothing what your father signed. You are the heir of the entail. But your uncle is a man to fight the indefensible, and it would be likely your identity that he would call in question. A lawsuit is always expensive, and a family lawsuit always scandalous. Besides which, if any of your doings with your friend Mr. Thompson were to come out, we might find that we had burned our fingers. The kidnapping, to be sure, would be a court card upon our side, if we could only prove it. But it may be more difficult to prove, and my advice, upon the whole, is to make a very easy bargain with your uncle, perhaps even leaving him at Shaw's, where he has taken root for a quarter of a century, and contenting yourself in the meanwhile with a fair provision. I told him I was very willing to be easy, and that to carry family concerns before the public was a step from which I was naturally much averse. In the meantime, thinking to myself, I began to see the outlines of that scheme on which we afterwards acted. The great affair, I asked, is to bring home to him the kidnapping. Surely, said Mr. Rankeller, and if possible, out of court. For mark you here, Mr. David, we could no doubt find some men of the Covenant who would swear to your reclusion. But once they were in the box, we could no longer check their testimony, and some word of your friend Mr. Thompson must certainly crop out, which, from what you have let fall, I cannot think to be desirable. Well, sir, said I, here's my way of it, and I opened my plot to him. But this would seem to involve my meeting the man Thompson, says he, when I had done. I think so indeed, sir, said I. Dear doctor, cries he, rubbing his brow. Dear doctor, no, Mr. David, I am afraid your scheme is inadmissible. I say nothing against your friend, Mr. Thompson. I know nothing against him, and if I did, mark this, Mr. David, it would be my duty to lay hands on him. Now, I put it to you, is it wise to meet? He may have matters to his charge. He may not have told you all. His name may not even be Thompson, cried the lawyer, twinkling, for some of these fellows will pick up names by the roadside, as another would gather haws. You must be the judge, sir, said I. But I was clear that my plan had taken hold upon his fancy, for he kept musing to himself till we were called to dinner, and the company of Mrs. Rankeller and that lady had scarce left us again to ourselves, and a bottle of wine, ere he was back, harping on my proposal. When and where was I to meet my friend Mr. Thompson? Was I sure of Mr. T.'s discretion? Supposing we could catch the old fox tripping, would I consent to such and such a term of an agreement? These and the like questions he kept asking at long intervals, while he thoughtfully rolled his wine upon his tongue. When I had answered all of them, seemingly to his contentment, he fell into a still deeper muse, even the claret being now forgotten. Then he got a sheet of paper and a pencil, and set to work writing and weighing every word, and at last touched a bell and had his clerk into the chamber. "Torrance," said he, "I must have this written out fair against tonight, and when it is done, you will be so kind as to put on your hat and be ready to come along with this gentleman and me, for you will probably be wanted as a witness." "What, sir," cried I, as soon as the clerk was gone, "are you to venture it?" "Why, so it would appear," says he, filling his glass. "But let us speak no more of business. The very sight of Torrance brings in my head a little droll matter of some years ago, when I had made a tryst with the poor oaf at the Cross of Edinburgh. Each had gone his proper errand, and when it came 4 o'clock, Torrance had been taking a glass, and did not know his master, and I, who had forgot my spectacles, was so blind without them, that I give you my word I did not know my own clerk. And thereupon he laughed heartily. I said it was an odd chance, and smiled out of politeness. But what held me all the afternoon in wonder, he kept returning and dwelling on this story, and telling it again with fresh details and laughter, so that I began at last to be quite put out of countenance, and feel ashamed for my friend's folly. Toward the time I had appointed with Allen, we set out from the house, Mr. Rainkeller and I arm in arm, and Torrance following behind with the deed in his pocket and a covered basket in his hand. All through the town the lawyer was bowing right and left, and continually being buttonholed by gentlemen on matters of burgh or private business, and I could see he was one greatly looked up to in the country. At last we were clear of the houses, and began to go along the side of the haven and toward the Hawes Inn and the ferry pier, the scene of my misfortune. I could not look upon the place without emotion, recalling how many that had been there with me that day were now no more. Ransom taken, I could hope, from the evil to come. Sean passed, where I dared not follow him, and the poor souls that had gone down with the brig in her last plunge. All these, and the brig herself, I had outlived, and come through these hardships and fearful perils without scathe. My only thought should have been of gratitude, and yet I could not behold the place without sorrow for others, and a chill of recollected fear. I was so thinking when, upon a sudden, Mr. Rainkeller cried out, clapping his hands to his pockets, and began to laugh. "Why," he cries, "if this be not a farcical adventure, after all that I said, I have forgot my glasses." At that, of course, I understood the purpose of his anecdote, and knew that if he had left his spectacles at home, it had been done on purpose, so that he might not have the benefit of Allen's help, without the awkwardness of recognizing him. And indeed, it was well thought upon, for now, supposing things to go the very worst, how could Rainkeller swear to my friend's identity, or how be made to bear damaging evidence against myself? For all that, he had been a long while of finding out his want, and had spoken to and recognized a good few persons as we came through the town, and I had little doubt of myself that he saw reasonably well. As soon as we were past the Hawes, where I recognized the landlord smoking his pipe in the door, and was amazed to see him look no older, Mr. Rainkeller changed the order of march, walking behind with Torrance, and sending me forward in the manner of a scout. I went up the hill, whistling from time to time my Gaelic air, and at length I had the pleasure to hear it answered, and to see Allen rise from behind a bush. He was somewhat dashed in spirits, having passed a long day alone, skulking in the country, and made but a poor meal in an alehouse near Dundas. But at the mere sight of my clothes he began to brighten up, and as soon as I had told him in what a forward state our affairs were, and the part I looked to him to play in what remained, he sprang into a new man. "And that is a very good notion of yours," says he, "and I dare to say that you could lay your hands upon no better man to put it through than Alan Breck. It is not a thing, mark ye, that anyone could do, but takes a gentleman of penetration. But it sticks in my head your lawyermen will be somewhat wearying to see me," said Allen. Accordingly, I cried and waved on Mr. Rankeller, who came up alone and was presented to my friend Mr. Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, I am pleased to meet you," said he. "But I have forgotten my glasses, and our friend Mr. David here," clapping me on the shoulder, "will tell you that I am little better than blind, and that you must not be surprised if I pass you by tomorrow." This he said, thinking that Alan would be pleased, but the Highlander's vanity was ready to startle at a less matter than that. "Why, sir," says he stiffly, "I would say it mattered the less, as we are met here for a particular end, to see justice done to Mr. Balfour, and by what I can see, not very likely to have much else in common. But I accept your apology, which was a very proper one to make." "And that is more than I could look for, Mr. Thompson," said Rankeller heartily. "And now, as you and I are the chief actors in this enterprise, I think we should come into a nice agreement, to which end I propose that you should lend me your arm, for, what with the dusk and the want of my glasses, I am not very clear as to the path. And as for you, Mr. David, you will find Torrance a pleasant kind of body to speak with. Only, let me remind you, it's quite needless he should hear more of your adventures, or those of Mr. Thompson." Wow, hey Natalie, thank you for the raid. That's awesome. Welcome, welcome. Thank you for doing the shout out, Vela. Well, thank you for the follow very much. How are you guys all doing today? I don't think we've met before, Natalie. What do you stream? Obviously, I read books online. We're just finishing up Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Got 2 chapters left, I think. Yep, 2 chapters left. All right. Well, while you guys get sorted, I'll get back to it. We are just finishing up chapter 28. Story of David Balfour. He was his father passed away, and he went to his uncle to claim his inheritance and the last remaining member of his family. And his uncle had him kidnapped by pirates and shipped off to be an indentured servant in the colonies. But he escaped during a shipwreck and had a bunch of adventures trying to get through the Highlands of Scotland back home and to his attorney to claim his inheritance and his rights. And now he and his attorney are going up to face his uncle and try and reclaim his patrimony. Accordingly, these two went on ahead in very close talk, and Torrance and I brought up the rear. Night was come when we came in view of the house of Shaw's. 10 had been gone some time. It was dark and mild, with a pleasant rustling wind in the southwest that covered the sound of our approach. And as we drew near, we saw no glimmer of light in any portion of the building. It seemed my uncle was already in bed, which was indeed the best thing for our arrangements. We made our last whispered consultations some 50 yards away, and then the lawyer and Torrance and I crept quietly up and crouched down beside the corner of the house. And as soon as we were in our places, Alan strode to the door without concealment and began to knock. Chapter 29. I come into my kingdom. For some time, Alan volleyed upon the door, and his knocking only roused the echoes of the house and neighborhood. At last, however, I could hear the noise of a window gently thrust up, and knew that my uncle had come to his observatory. By what light there was, he would see Alan standing like a dark shadow upon the steps. The 3 witnesses were quite out of his view, so that there was nothing to alarm an honest man in his own house. For all that, he studied his visitor a while in silence, and when he spoke, his voice had a quaver of misgiving. "What's this?" says he. "This is nae kind of time of night for decent folk, and I ha' nae troukings with nighthawks. What brings ye here? I have a blunderbush." "Is that yourself, Mr. Balfour?" returned Alan, stepping back and looking up into the darkness. "Have a care of that blunderbuss. They're nast things to burst." What brings you here, and where are you? Says my uncle angrily. I have no manner of inclination to rout out my name to the countryside, said Alan. But what brings me here is another story, being more of your affair than mine. And if you're sure it's what you would like, I'll set it to a tune and sing it to you. And what is't? Asked my uncle. David, says Alan. What was that? Cried my uncle in a mighty changed voice. Shall I give you the rest of the name then? Said Alan. There's a pause, and then, I'm thinking I'll better let you in, says my uncle doubtfully. I dare say that, said Alan, but the point is, would I go? Now I will tell you what I am thinking. I am thinking that it is here upon this doorstep that we must confer upon this business, and it shall be here, or nowhere at all whatever, for I would have you to understand that I am as stiff-necked as yourself, and a gentleman of better family. This change of note disconcerted Ebenezer. He was a little while digesting it, and then says he, Well, what must be must, and shut the window. But it took him a long time to get downstairs, and a still longer to undo the fastenings, repenting, I dare say, and taken with fresh claps of fear at every second step and every bolt and bar. At last, however, we heard the creak of the hinges, and it seems my uncle slipped gingerly out, seeing that Alan had stepped back a pace or two, sat him down on the top doorstep with the blunderbuss ready in his hands. Now, says he, mind I have my blunderbush, and if you take a step nearer, you're as good as dead. In a very civil speech, says Alan, to be sure. Nah, says my uncle, but this is no very chancy kind of a proceeding, and I'm bound to be prepared. And now that we understand each other, you can name your business. Why, says Alan, you that are a man of so much understanding will doubtless have perceived that I am a Highland gentleman. My name has nae business in my story, but the county of my friends is no very far from the Isle of Mull, of which you will have heard. It seems there was a ship lost in those parts, and the next day a gentleman of my family was seeking wreckwood for his fire along the sands, when he came upon a lad that was half drowned. Well, he brought him to, and he and some other gentlemen took and clapped him in an old ruined castle, where from that day to this he has been a great expense to my friends. My friends are a wee wild-like, and not so particular about the law as some that I could name, and finding that the lad owned some decent folk, and was your born nephew, Mr. Balfour, they asked me to give you a bit of call and confer upon the matter. And I may tell you that at the off-go, unless we can agree upon some terms, ye are little likely to set eyes upon him. For my friends, added Alan, simply, are no very well off. My uncle cleared his throat. I'm no very caring, says he. He wasna a good lad at the best of it, and I've nae call to interfere. Aye, said Alan. I see what you would be at, pretending you don't care, to make the ransom smaller. Nah, said my uncle. It's the mere truth. I take nae manner of interest in the lad, and I'll pay nae ransom, and ye can make a kirk and a mill of him for what I care. Hoot, sir, said Alan. Blood's thicker than water, in the Dale's name. You cannot desert your brother's son for the fair shame of it, and if you did, and it came to be kent, you would nae be very popular in your countryside, or I'm the more deceived. I'm no just very popular the way it is, returned Ebenezer, and I dinna see how you would come to be kent. Not by me, onyway, nor yet by you or your friends. So that's idle talk, my bucky, says he. Then it'll have to be David that tells it, said Alan. How's that, says my uncle sharply. Oh, just this way, says Alan. My friends would doubtless keep your nephew as long as there was any likelihood of siller to be made of it. But if there was nane, I am clearly of opinion they would let him gang where he pleased, and be damned to him. Aye, but I'm no very caring about that either, said my uncle. I wouldna be muckle made up with that. I was thinking that, said Alan. And what for why? Asked Ebenezer. Why, Mr. Balfour, replied Alan. But all that I could hear, there were two ways of it. Either you liked David, and would pay to get him back, or else you had very good reasons for not wanting him, and would pay for us to keep him. It seems it's not the first. Well, then it's the second, and blithe am I to ken it, for it should be a pretty penny in my pocket, in the pocket of my friends. I dinna follow you there, said my uncle. No, said Alan. Well, see here, you dinna want the lad back. Well, what do you want done with him, and how much will you pay? My uncle made no answer, but shifted uneasily on his seat. Come, sir, cried Alan, I would have you to ken that I am a gentleman. I bear a king's name. I am nae rider to kick my shanks at your hall door.
Either give me an answer in civility, and that out of hand, or by the top of Glencoe, I will ram 3 feet of iron through your vitals." "Eh, man," cried my uncle, scrambling to his feet. "Give me a minute. What's like wrong with you? I'm just a plain man and nae dancing master, and if I'm trying to be as civil as it's morally possible. As for that wild talk, it's fair disreputable. Vitals, says you, and where would I be with my blunderbuss?" he snarled. "Powder in your old hands are but as the snail to the swallow against the bright steel in the hands of Allen," said the other. "Before your jottering finger could find the trigger, the hilt would dirl on your breastbane." "Eh, man was denying it," said my uncle. "Pit it as ye please. Ha'n't your own way. I'll do nothing to cross you. Just tell me what like you be wanting. You'll see that we can agree fine." "Troth, sir," said Allen, "I ask for nothing but plain dealing. In 2 words, do you want the lad killed or kept?"
Pardon me.
"Oh, sirs," cried Ebenezer. "Oh, sirs me, that's no kind of language." "Killed or kept," repeated Allen. "Oh, keep it," wailed my uncle. "We'll have nae bloodshed, if you please." "Well," says Allen, "as you please, that'll be the dear." "The dear," cries Ebenezer. "Would you foul your hands with crime?" "Hoot," said Allen, "they're both crime whatever, and the killing's easier and quicker and sure. Keeping the lad'll be a fascist job, a fascist kittle business." "I'll have him keep it, though," returned my uncle. "I never had naething to do with anything morally wrong, and I'll no gone to begin to pleasure a wild Highlandman." Sorry, throat's getting worn out. But I want to finish this. Your uncle is scrupulous," sneered Allen. "I'm a man of principle," said Ebenezer simply. "If I have to pay for it, I'll have to pay for it. And besides," says he, "you forget the lad's my brother's son." "Well, well," said Allen. "And now about the price. It's no very easy for me to set a name upon it. I'd first have to ken some small manners. I'd have to ken, for instance, what you gave Hosian at the first off-go." "Hosian!" cries my uncle, struck back. "What for?" "For kidnapping David," says Allen. "It's a lee, it's a black lee," cried my uncle. "He was never kidnapped. You lead in his throat that told you that. Kidnapped he never was." "That's no fault of mine, nor yet of yours," said Allen, "nor yet of Hosian's, if he is a man that can be trusted." "What do you mean?" cried Ebenezer. "Did Hosian tell you?" "Why, you donnered old rond. How else would I ken?" cried Allen. "Hosian and I are partners. We gang share, so you can see for yourself what good you can do laying. And I must plainly say you drove a fool's bargain when you let a man like the sailorman so far forward in your private matters." "But that's past praying for, and you must lie on your bed the way you made it. And the point in hand is just this. What did you pay him?" "Has he told you himself?" asked my uncle. "That's my concern," said Allen. "Weel," said my uncle, "I dinna care what he said. He lied, and the solemn God's truth is this, that I gave him £20, but I'll be perfectly honest with you, for by that he was to have the selling of the lad in Caroliny. Wilk would be his mucklemar, but no from my pocket, you see." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That will do exceedingly well," said the lawyer, stepping forward, and then mighty civilly. "Good evening, Mr. Balfour," said he. "And good evening, Uncle Ebenezer," said I. "It's a braw night, Mr. Balfour had towards us." "Never a word," said my uncle, "neither black nor white, but just sat where he was on the top doorstep and stared upon us like a man turned to stone." Allen filched away his blunderbuss, and the lawyer, taking him by the arm, plucked him up from the doorstep, led him into the kitchen, whither we all followed, and set him down in a chair beside the hearth, where the fire was out and only a rushlight burning. There we all looked upon him for a while, exulting greatly in our success, but yet with a sort of pity for the man's shame. "Come, come, Mr. Ebenezer," said the lawyer, "you must not be downhearted, for I promise you we shall make easy terms. In the meanwhile, give us the cellar key, and Torrance shall draw us a bottle of your father's wine in honor of the event." Then, turning to me and taking me by the hand, "Mr. David," says he, "I wish you all joy in your good fortune, which I believe to be deserved." And then to Allan, with a spice of drollery, "Mr. Thompson, I pay you my compliment. It was most artfully conducted. But in one point you somewhat outran my comprehension. Do I understand your name to be James, or Charles, or is it George, perhaps?" "And why should it be any of the three, sir?" quoth Allan, drawing himself up like one who smelt an offence. "Only, sir, that you mentioned a king's name," replied Rankeller. "And, as there has never been yet a King Thompson, or his fame, at least, has never come my way, I judged you must refer to that you had in baptism." This was just the stab that Allan would feel keenest, and I am free to confess he took it very ill. Not a word would he answer, but stepped off to the far end of the kitchen, and sat down and sulked. And it was not till I stepped after him, and gave him my hand, and thanked him by title as the chief spring of my success, that he began to smile a bit, and was at last prevailed upon to join our party. By that time we had the fire lighted, and a bottle of wine uncorked. A good supper came out of the basket, to which Torrance and I and Allan set ourselves down, while the lawyer and my uncle passed into the next chamber to consult. They stayed there closeted about an hour, at the end of which period they had come to a good understanding, and my uncle and I set our hands to the agreement in a formal manner. By the terms of this, my uncle was confirmed for life in the possession of the house and lands, and bound himself to satisfy Rankeller as to his intromissions, and to pay me 2 clear thirds of the yearly income of Shaw's. So, the beggar in the ballad had come home, and when I lay down that night on the kitchen chests, I was a man of means and had a name in the country. Allan and Torrance and Rankeller slept and snored on their hard beds. But for me, who had lain out under heaven and upon dirt and stones so many days and nights, and often with an empty belly and in fear of death, this good change in my case unmanned me more than any of the former evil ones, and I lay till dawn, looking at the fire on the roof and planning the future. Chapter 30. And this is the final chapter. Goodbye. So far as I was concerned myself, I had come to port. But I had still Allan, to whom I was so much beholden, on my hands, and I felt besides a heavy charge in the matter of the murder, and James of the Glens. On both these heads I unbosomed to Rankeller the next morning, walking to and fro about 6 of the clock before the house of Shaw's, and with nothing in view but the fields and woods that had been my ancestors, and were now mine. Even as I spoke on these grave subjects, my eye would take a glad bit of a run over the prospect, and my heart jump with pride. About my clear duty to my friend, the lawyer had no doubt. I must help him out of the country at whatever risk, but in the case of James he was of a different mind. "Mr. Thompson," says he, "is one thing, Mr. Thompson's kinsman quite another. I know little of the facts, but I gather that a great noble, whom we will call, if you like, the D of A, has some concern and is even supposed to feel some animosity in the matter. The D of A is doubtless an excellent nobleman, but, Mr. David, timeo qui nocere Deus, if you interfere to balk his vengeance, you should remember there is one way to shut your testimony out, and that is to put you in the dock. There you would be in the same pickle as Mr. Thompson's kinsman. You will object that you are innocent. Well, but so is he, and to be tried for your life before a Highland journey, on a Highland quarrel, and with a Highland judge upon the bench, would be a brief transition to the gallows." Now, I had made all these reasonings before, and found no very good reply to them, so I put on all the simplicity I could. "In that case, sir," said I would just have to be hanged, would I not?" "My dear boy," cries he, "go in God's name and do what you think is right. It is a poor thought that at my time of life I should be advising you to choose the safe and shameful, and I take it back with an apology. Go and do your duty, and be hanged if you must, like a gentleman. There are worse things in the world than to be hanged." "Not many, sir," said I, smiling. "Why, yes, sir," he cried, "very many, and it would be 10 times better for your uncle, to go no farther afield, if he were dangling decently upon a gibbet." Thereupon he turned into the house, still in a great fervour of mind, so that I saw I had pleased him heartily, and there he wrote me 2 letters, making his comments on them as he wrote. This, says he, is to my bankers, the British Linen Company, placing a credit to your name. Consult Mr. Thompson. He will know of ways, and you with this credit can supply the means. I trust you will be a good husband of your money, but in the affair of a friend like Mr. Thompson, I would be even prodigal. Then, for his kinsman, there is no better way than that you should seek the advocate, tell him your tale, and offer testimony. Whether he may take it or not is quite another matter, and will turn on the D of A. Now that you may reach the Lord Advocate well recommended, I give you here a letter to a namesake of your own, the learned Mr. Balfour of Pilrig, a man whom I esteem. It will look better that you should be presented by one of your own name, and the Laird of Pilrig is much looked up to in the faculty, and stands well with the Lord Advocate Grant. I would not trouble him, if I were you, with any particulars. And do you know, I think it would be needless to refer to Mr. Thompson. Form yourself the Lord. He is a good model. When you deal with the advocate, be discreet, and in all these matters may the Lord guide you, Mr. David. Thereupon he took his farewell, and set out with Torrance for the ferry, while Alan and I turned our faces for the city of Edinburgh. As we went by the footpath and beside the gateposts and the unfinished lodge, we kept looking back at the house of my fathers. It stood there, bare and great and smokeless, like a place not lived in. Only in one of the top windows there was the peak of a nightcap, bobbing up and down, back and forward, like the head of a rabbit from a burrow. I had little welcome when I came, and less kindness while I stayed, but at least I was watched as I went away. Alan and I went slowly forward upon our way, having little heart either to walk or speak. The same thought was uppermost in both, that we were near the time of our parting, and remembrance of all the bygone days sat upon us sorely. We talked indeed of what should be done, and it was resolved that Alan should keep to the county, biding now here, now there, but coming once in the day to a particular place where I might be able to communicate with him, either in my own person or by messenger. In the meanwhile I was to seek out a lawyer who was an Appin Stewart, and a man therefore to be wholly trusted, and it should be his part to find a ship and to arrange for Alan's safe embarkation. No sooner was this business done than the words seemed to leave us, and though I would seek to jest with Alan under the name of Mr. Thompson, and he with me on my new clothes and my estate, you could feel very well that we were nearer tears than laughter. We came by the byway over the hill of Corstorphine, and when we got near to the place called Rest and Be Thankful, and looked down upon the Corstorphine bogs, and over to the city, and the castle on the hill, we both stopped, for we both knew without a word said that we had come to where our ways parted. Here he repeated to me once again what had been agreed upon between us, the address of the lawyer, the daily hour at which Alan might be found, and the signals that were to be made by any that came seeking him. Then I gave what money I had, a guinea or two of Rainkeller's, so that he should not starve in the meanwhile, and then we stood a space, and looked over at Edinburgh in silence. "Well, goodbye," said Alan, and held out his left hand. "Goodbye," said I, and gave the hand a little grasp, and went off down the hill. Neither one of us looked the other in the face, nor so long as he was in my view did I take one back glance at the friend I was leaving. But as I went on my way to the city, I felt so lost and lonesome that I could have found it in my heart to sit down by the dike and cry and weep like any baby. It was coming near noon when I passed in by the West Kirk and the grass market into the streets of the capital. The huge height of the buildings, running up to 10 and 15 stories, the narrow, arched entries that continually vomited passengers, and the wares of the merchants in their windows, the hubbub and endless stir, the foul smells and the fine clothes, and 100 other particulars, too small to mention, struck me into a kind of stupor of surprise, so that I let the crowd carry me to and fro. And yet all the time what I was thinking was Alan at rest and be thankful. And all the time, although you would think I would not choose but to be delighted with these brazen novelties, there was a cold gnawing in my inside, like a remorse for something wrong. The very hand of Providence brought me in my drifting to the very doors of the British Linen Company's bank. Just there, with his hand upon his fortune, the present editor inclines, for the time, to say farewell to David. How Alan escaped, and what was done about the murder, with a variety of other delectable particulars, may be some day set forth. That is a thing, however, that hinges on the public fancy. The editor has a great kindness for both Alan and David, and would gladly spend much of his life in their society. But in this he may find himself to stand alone. In the fear of which, unless anyone should complain of scurvy usage, he hastens to protest that all went well with both, in the limited and human sense of the word well, that whatever befell them, it was not dishonor, and whatever failed them, they were not found wanting to themselves. So the author closed with a, by the way, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger just so you'll buy the next book. And the only way you're getting any kind of like closure to that is if you guys support me and buy my book. It's a little dirty. Funny though. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed the book. I do believe we're going to be reading Jekyll and Hyde next, starting on Wednesday. Although our subscriber reading will be on Monday at 7 p.m. Pacific time. That's a new time slot, because the original Thursday time slot we had for it wasn't really working out for people. As schedules changed with people going back to work in person and social activities taking off. So we're going to try this new time slot, see if it works more for the wonderful and amazing people that support me. And as Velo put on there is where you can support the stream and sign up to be a subscriber, because we didn't sign the affiliate contract. Instead, we went with Patreon. The subscriber read that I've been requested is a little more adult than most of my streams, so please don't let your kids come to it. If you have children, we are going to read, and I can't believe I'm saying this, we're going to read at least a couple chapters of 50 Shades. Yeah, that's happening. So, if you feel like something a bit more adult than the usual fare, and you want to support the stream, come Monday at the Discord, and it'll be there for all the subscribers, and we will be reading a few chapters of Mr. Gray's adventures. I haven't read it before. I am apprehensive. I'm not sure how this is going to go. But we will see. And I will render my best performance of the work, whatever that happens to be. There was a lot of arm twisting. A lot of arm twisting for this one. Yeah. The subscriber read is where we read books that are still under copyright, because it's not broadcast the way Twitch does, and it's not recorded. And so we're able to fall under like a book club, coffee shop carve out with the copyright law. So it allows us to read a greater variety of books and read some of your favorites and stuff that just came out and bestsellers and whatnot. But because they aren't recorded, if you aren't there, you're going to miss it. So please do come, enjoy, and yeah. Thank you again to Natalie for the raid and to all the wonderful people that came with her. I hope you enjoyed the book, and I have more content available both in the VODs on Twitch and backed up to YouTube. So if you're interested in going and looking back over some of the past reads and that kind of thing, that's where you can catch up to them, is on the YouTube. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see some of you at least Monday. And a couple of you, I'm going to do some gaming after this. I think we're going to play some Civ 6 or maybe some Path of Exile or even 7 Days to Die. We'll see. But I'll be in the Discord. You all are welcome to join me there. Vela, if you don't mind posting the link again. I know it was not too far back in the chat. But come join the Discord. Hang out with us. Talk. There's channels for book requests and discussing the stories that we've read, asking for your favorites, all that kind of fun stuff. We play a couple of games together as a community. We even have a community Minecraft server that you can jump on for those that like to play that. And yeah, I look forward to meeting the new people, and I will see the people who have been standing by me for a while here shortly. So, have a great and wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, night, whatever it happens to be. Latina, thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. I hope you come back and enjoy the next story that we read. And Natalie, once again, thank you so much. That was an awesome raid. I really appreciate it. But we will close the stream there. Let's see. Our people that we usually raid are not online, so I don't think any raid today. But maybe we should hunt up and find some more people to raid in the future. Add to our list of wonderful people. Definitely gonna have to check out Natalie and see what she does. So, thank you again, and good night.